The story of Kevin Costner is often told through the lens of a sweeping cinematic epic, much like the westerns he has spent a lifetime perfecting. To understand the man and the list of adversaries he has collected over the decades, one must first look at the literal and figurative growth he experienced as a young man. Costner was not always the imposing, authoritative figure the world sees today. In his youth, he was a late bloomer, a kid who felt somewhat trapped in a smaller frame until a sudden and dramatic transformation took place. During his senior year of high school, while battling a grueling case of mononucleosis, Costner's body underwent a staggering change. He grew nearly 8 inches in a matter of months, a physical stretching that felt almost violent in its speed. This period of being stretched out and physically vulnerable, while his peers were already finding their footing, perhaps instilled in him the quiet, observant nature that would become his trademark. He learned to watch people from a distance, to analyze their movements and their motives before stepping into the fray. By the time he became a household name, he wasn't just a movie star. He was a man who had meticulously constructed a moral code based on order, respect, and a deep-seated hatred for chaos. This background is essential because it explains why he reacted so strongly to the legendary Marlon Brando. To the public, Brando was the pinnacle of the craft, but to Costner, he was the embodiment of the very instability he had spent his life trying to avoid. The friction began in the mid-1980s during the casting of The Untouchables. When producers suggested Brando for the role of Jimmy Malone, Costner didn't see an opportunity to work with a master. He saw a threat to the production's integrity. He had studied the disastrous history of Brando's later career, specifically the legendary nightmare of Apocalypse Now. In the jungles of the Philippines, Brando had held a multi-million-dollar production hostage by showing up unprepared and overweight, demanding that the world bend to his whims. Costner, a man who believes in the sanctity of the script and the schedule, viewed this as a professional sin. Even years later, when Brando was terrorizing Frank Oz on the set of The Score, calling him names and refusing to take direction, Costner remained firm in his assessment. He saw Brando not as a genius, but as a walking storm that ruined everything it touched. For Costner, the decision to stay away from Brando wasn't about a lack of appreciation for acting. It was about a refusal to let a monstrous ego derail the collective effort of a crew. This rigid adherence to a code of conduct often put Costner at odds with those who treated fame like a playground rather than a responsibility. No incident illustrates this better than his brief, stinging encounter with Madonna. In the early 1990s, Costner was at the height of his powers, a traditionalist in an era that was becoming increasingly cynical. When he went backstage at Madonna's Blonde Ambition tour, he wasn't looking for a headline. He was simply offering a polite, Midwestern courtesy to a fellow artist. His choice of the word neat to describe her provocative and groundbreaking show was perhaps a mismatch for the environment, but it was genuine. Madonna's reaction, mocking him for the cameras of her documentary Truth or Dare, was a turning point for Costner. It wasn't just that she was rude. It was that she used his politeness as ammunition to build her own brand of cool at his expense. She turned a private moment of respect into a public display of humiliation. For a man who values privacy and dignity, this was an unforgivable breach. He didn't scream or issue press releases, but he quietly archived the experience as a lesson in the dangers of performative cruelty. When he later told the world he didn't care for her, it wasn't a petty swipe. It was a formal closing of a door. This same sense of protective boundaries extended to his view of Bruce Willis. While the two never shared a film set, their orbits in Hollywood were close enough for Costner to hear the echoes of Willis's behavior. Costner has always viewed the film set as a workplace where everyone, from the director to the person holding the boom mic, deserves a baseline of respect. The stories of Willis's soul-crushing behavior on sets like Moonlighting or his later reputation for being undirectable were enough to make Costner avoid him entirely. He heard about the tantrums over lighting and the arrogance of an actor who believed he was too big to be fired. To Costner, that kind of attitude is a toxin. He famously remarked that there is no room for people who destroy sets to prove a point, a statement that served as a permanent barrier between him and the action star. He wasn't interested in the box office potential of a pairing with Willis if it meant dealing with the emotional debris of a man who didn't respect the process. Costner's list of evil figures isn't about talent. It's about the preservation of the work environment. The conflict between Kevin Costner and the more volatile elements of the film industry often boiled down to a fundamental difference in how they viewed the power of their positions. While some used their status to dominate others, Costner used his to enforce a strict, almost military-like discipline on his sets. This brought him into a silent but intense opposition with Alec Baldwin long before the world saw Baldwin's career take its more tragic turns. Costner's disdain for Baldwin wasn't born from a single movie set, but from a cumulative observation of Baldwin's public persona. He was particularly struck by the infamous voicemail incident in 2007, where Baldwin's temper was turned toward his own daughter. To a man like Costner, who prizes the role of the provider and the protector, this was a glimpse into a character flaw that no amount of acting talent could cover. He watched as Baldwin moved through Hollywood, seemingly immune to the consequences of his own volatility, whether it was altercations with the press or creating a minefield for the crew on the set of 30 Rock. Costner has always believed that a set should be a sanctuary of productivity, not a place where people have to walk on eggshells to avoid the lead actor's wrath. When Baldwin was involved in a parking space assault years later, it only confirmed what Costner had suspected for a long time, that some men simply do not value the second chances they are given. This wasn't a professional rivalry in the traditional sense. It was a moral rejection. Costner's refusal to associate with Baldwin was a statement that character eventually outweighs fame, and that a lack of self-control is the ultimate professional failure. This same commitment to professional standards led to a surprising and painful fracture with Robert Duvall during the production of Open Range. For Costner, Duvall was a hero, a man he had looked up to for years. However, when the two finally collaborated, the reality of Duvall's stubbornness shattered the idol. The issues began with a power struggle over billing, but they quickly bled onto the set in New Mexico. Duvall, despite being an actor in a film Costner was directing, refused to acknowledge Costner's authority. He challenged directions in front of the crew, creating a tension that threatened the very fabric of the production. Costner was forced to maintain a professional facade for the sake of the film, but the experience left him deeply disillusioned. He realized that even the legends he admired could be monsters of ego when their status was challenged. The trust that had existed before the cameras rolled died in the dirt of that set, and while they finished the movie, the friendship was a casualty of Duvall's refusal to be a team player. The most intellectually demanding of Costner's feuds, however, was his battle with Oliver Stone during the filming of JFK. This wasn't a clash of egos in the traditional sense, but a war over the nature of truth itself. Costner stepped into the role of Jim Garrison with a sense of historical duty, believing that the film carried a weight that transcended entertainment. Stone, on the other hand, was a filmmaker who believed in shaping history to fit a narrative. The two men clashed almost immediately in the production offices of Dallas and New Orleans. Costner would question the factual basis of a scene, only to be met with Stone's insistence that the audience didn't want facts, they wanted a compelling truth. This distinction was repulsive to Costner, who saw it as a dangerous manipulation of a national tragedy. The arguments became so heated that they often delayed the start of the shooting day, with the crew watching as the director and his leading man fought over every line and every historical implication. One witness recalled Stone slamming his binder and declaring himself the author of history, a level of hubris that Costner found fundamentally wrong. Although Costner supported the film publicly and gave one of the best performances of his career, he left the experience with a permanent wariness of Stone's methods. He saw in Stone a director who was willing to twist reality to win an argument, a trait that Costner associated with a lack of integrity. This experience rounded out his list of those he considered evil, or at least deeply problematic, not because they lacked skill, but because they lacked a commitment to a higher standard of behavior. Whether it was the chaos of Brando, the cruelty of Madonna, the volatility of Willis and Baldwin, the ego of Duvall, or the manipulation of Stone. Each person on this list represented a departure from the good man archetype Costner has spent his life trying to embody. He has finally reached a point where he no longer feels the need to hide these opinions. By exposing the 9 actors and directors he claims are problematic, he is attempting to warn the next generation that Hollywood is often a house of mirrors, where the most beloved icons are sometimes the ones hiding the darkest spirits. He has walked away from these people not out of fear, but out of a desire to keep his own circle clean. For Kevin Costner, the ultimate victory isn't a box office record or an Oscar. It's the ability to look at his own reflection and know that he never compromised his dignity for the sake of a scene.